This is the story of a different world, and yet very much a story of today's world. The story stretches back 100 years and has lived and grown in the spirits of hundreds of dedicated men and women. Teachers, sailors, ministers, scholars, philanthropists, nurses, doctors, staff, and volunteers. This is the story of the Maine Seacoast Mission, of a century of hope on a sea of change. New England in the 1900s was in many ways an inhospitable place, and for those who made their livings from the land or toiled at sea, life was hard. But these villages, these families were not alone. These people were not forgotten. Two men, Reverend Alexander MacDonald and his brother, Reverend Angus MacDonald, shared an idea.
So many sturdy souls along this Maine coast, Angus. It is a hard life on these rocks. But there they are, these people. They are the best New England blood, a sturdy, independent race. Despite so much, they cling to these capes and bays like lichen to the rocks.
They are fighting a most unequal battle for life and livelihood, many spiritually adrift as well.
True, many cannot hear words of hope over the roar of the sea. But Angus, I cannot help but wonder, what have they in common?
These islands are their lives.
And this places them apart from any church or parish. We are lucky here on the mainland, Angus. We need travel no great distance to find guidance, a helping hand, a doctor, schools for the children, but it is not so for these island people. These simple things might give them a better life, give them the strength to resist the evils of the world, but such things are almost non-existent on the islands.
You are right. The winds of human kindness do not always favor these isolated shores or their people. A breeze.
There is a message of hope in that breeze, Angus. Brother, look. This same breeze sweeps through the lives of hundreds of people. The same wind that carries these fisherfolk home to their families might also carry a message of hope, the chance of a better life, and the helping hand of Christian charity. Look, Angus. In that direction is Kittery Point, and over there is Quoddy Head. All of Maine laid out before us, with its islands strewn like the seeds of the sower cast upon the soil.
And there is good soil in the hearts of these fine island people.
History has left us with this version of the start of the mission, and while details may have been lost or changed over the last 100 years, the ideas and hope shared by Alexander MacDonald and Angus MacDonald have held true. A parish laced together over rocks and sea, creating a spiritual fabric of the isolated island communities along the Maine coast. The concept was not entirely new. In the late 1880s, Captain George W. Lane had sailed the waters of the Maine coast in a small sloop, first as a lone missionary, then for a few years under the auspices of the American Sunday School Union. Though Lane was able to establish some Sunday schools on the islands, his missionary efforts were not long-lived. Still, what Lane accomplished did not go unappreciated or unnoticed. In an organized response to these problems along the coast, and at the urging of the Maine Missionary Society, brothers Alexander and Angus MacDonald came together with a number of other forward-thinking men and women to see what could be done. They met informally within the structure of the Bar Harbor Congregational Church, focusing on the inspiration behind Lane's efforts. And soon a committee was appointed to study a possible extension of Lane's work. Both Alex and Angus MacDonald were part of that committee, and both expressed their enthusiastic support for
a work which, we believe, will eventually cover the entire coast and reach the most isolated hamlets.
And on July 11th, 1905, the Maine Seacoast Missionary Society of Eden, Maine, was formally organized and set to work. One thing that has distinguished the mission throughout its history was true even then. Though Bar Harbor Congregational Church did provide preliminary support of the organization and an umbrella under which to work, the mission was, from its inception, entirely non-denominational in character. This was remarkable at a time when many social service organizations existed primarily to spread the doctrines of a single religion. This inclusive philosophy was one of many things that would continue to set the mission apart from other organizations. These first years were what Alexander MacDonald would come to consider a period of investigation, perhaps because he recognized, as he wrote in the mission's early documents,
to sail a sloop in a parish extending from Kittery Point to Quoddy Head along the broken coast of Maine in all kinds of weather is no small undertaking.
No small undertaking indeed. But who were Alexander and Angus MacDonald, the two men whose family name would become synonymous with the Maine Seacoast Mission? Reverend Gary DeLong, executive director of today's mission, believes it goes back beyond just the events that have been preserved in the story of Alex and Angus MacDonald on that Maine mountaintop.
The MacDonald brothers, I think of them all the time. I have Alex's picture in my office. I look up at it and am aware of it quite often. It wasn't that just one day he got a vision. I mean, I think there was something in his genes and in his faith.
Alexander Peter MacDonald was born in 1865 in the hamlet of Valleyfield on Prince Edward Island in Canada. He was an imposing man, tall, broad-shouldered, with what noted authority Mary Ellen Chase referred to as the blue-gray eyes of a sailor, at once sharp and thoughtful, yet the most kindly and humorous eyes. Even early in his pastoral life, Alex had a reputation as an intense, thunderous preacher, but his words were simple, practical, and showed his understanding of people. When Alex was young, his family moved to Maine, and he was educated at Farmington Normal School. His goal? To be a teacher. After graduation, Alex made his way to Coburn Classical Institution, and then on to the school now known as Andover Newton Theological Seminary. Alex served in Pullman, Washington, where he was ordained as a congregational minister, Burlington, Massachusetts, and New Waterford, Maine. In 1898, Alex and his young family, including wife Carrie and son Ralph, left North Waterford for a pastorate at the First Congregational Church in Wiscasset, Maine. And in 1901, Alex began what would be his last traditional pastoral position in service at Seal Harbor on Mount Desert Island. His brother, Angus Martin MacDonald, was born in Valleyfield just a few years after Alex in 1867. Angus, too, was educated at Farmington Normal School and Andover Newton, studying at Maine's Bowdoin College in between. But in 1894, Angus began his pastoral life in a part of the country far different from the New England coast where his brother served. Angus ministered at Jacksonville, Florida for almost 8 years, before coming to Bar Harbor Congregational Church in 1904. Together, these two men were a formidable pair, steeped in the American social gospel traditions of the turn of the century. Personal stories of the two men tell of Angus as the analyst and Alex as the worker. Angus called the plays, Alex carried the ball, so to speak. It was their shared philosophy, however, the idea that pastoral care begins after birth, not after death, that they would see bear fruit in the form of the Maine Seacoast Mission. The two brothers pooled the available funds and purchased a small boat to serve their intended purpose. Named the Hope, she was a scant 26 feet long, an auxiliary sailing sloop with a problematic naphtha-fueled engine. She came at the price of $600, and Captain Henry E. White was engaged as her captain and missionary. Looking at the Hope, how small and slight she seems in a winter sea, it's no wonder when asked who sailed the Hope that a local sailor of the day responded,
"Well, I don't just now recall, but I do know that he is either a saint or a fool."
That bit of Down East wisdom was not lost on the McDonald brothers or the other organizers of the mission, each of whom very quickly recognized the inadequacy of small boat, and by the end of that first year, the mission was pleased to accept a special gift. In 1906, early mission supporter Bishop Alexander Mackey Smith presented the mission with a 38-foot craft originally bearing the name the Virginian, rechristened in mission service as the Morning Star. Also in 1906, Alexander McDonald left his pastorate at Seal Harbor and began his tenure as mission superintendent, making him the mission's first full-time employee. As the Morning Star's trips settled into a pattern of 2 weeks eastward and 2 weeks westward, approximately 100 miles in each direction, Alexander McDonald's reports show that ministering to the island people was quickly taking on a much broader meaning. His work that year included visits to numerous island villages and settlements, attending to the sick in whatever way he was able, and conducting Sunday schools and Sunday services. Religious services often included discussions of matters far from the commonplace definition of religion: community problems, schools, building repairs, nearly everything. The breadth of the need in these coastal communities was undeniable, and the sensitivity of response quickly became the hallmark of Maine Seacoast Mission, as current Mission Board member Alan Baker explains.
I think the mission should look to the future with a great deal of confidence, because one of the things that has distinguished this organization for 100 years is the fact that we address the needs of people, whether it's their emotional needs, their spiritual needs, their physical needs, and sometimes even their medical needs.
In contemporary terms, what the mission was facing at its beginning was not only a spiritual void, but the need for human and social services. Captain White was soon compelled to resign from service aboard the Morning Star. An engineer for the boat was engaged to take his place at the helm, and ministerial duties fell squarely on Alexander McDonald. White cited a desire for more time to study, but noted that he was leaving primarily because of his health. The rigors of ministering and sailing full-time in the service of the Maine Seacoast Mission had taken their first toll. Captain White would not be the last to show the wear and tear of days and weeks at sea in all manner of weather, and of absorbing the weight of so many souls in need. These very early years of the mission were difficult. Telephones were almost unheard of in island and coastal settlements. Radio communication was enjoyed by only a few. Post offices were a rarity. The mission saw this last item, post offices, as one of the problems it could help solve, and at the urging of the mission, the government established post offices at Long Island, Eagle Island, and Louds Island. These were the first of many basic services that the mission would help to secure for island communities. One of the mission's first direct involvements with youth and education also came in these early years, as they pressed authorities to enforce truant laws so that children were not employed in fish canning plants when they should be in school. Soon again, with children and education firmly in mind, the mission embarked on an effort that would span years. Mission workers in the field noted that some 100 school children at coastal lighthouses were then still outside the educational system, receiving no formal education of any kind. Taking initiative and responsibility in the situation, in 1913, the mission sought funds from its supporters to employ a traveling teacher whose time would be designated specifically for these lighthouse children. Finally, in 1922, when the state of Maine discontinued any interest in support of a traveling lighthouse teacher, a system of transporting students to places where regular schools were already established took hold. And though uncertainty remained for many years about the education of the lighthouse and island children, eliciting the attention of governors, senators, numerous state and federal agencies, and nearly every mission superintendent, the Maine Seacoast Mission was instrumental in these initial efforts to provide and standardize their education, and the education of all island children became a lasting concern of the mission. The Maine Seacoast Mission had spent its first years adapting itself to the needs that it encountered, offering services reaching far beyond those originally envisioned. Perhaps the single most important development of these early years was the beginning of a tradition of trust between the mission and the island people it served. That tradition survives to this day, stronger for the years of joys and troubles it has survived. Rob Benson, the present-day pastor to the outer islands for the mission, felt this trust from the beginning of his association with the mission.
From the moment I started as pastor of the outer islands, I was very grateful and pretty overwhelmed to receive what I felt was a legacy of trust, that for almost 100 years, people on the islands have trusted the Seacoast Mission to be there when they need us there.
This legacy of trust has spanned the life of the mission. Coastal communities suffered in many ways, economically, spiritually, morally, socially. There were precious few churches or other organizations on the islands to lend a hand. Unlike many evangelical organizations of the day, the mission worked with the existing congregations on the islands, building bridges between them with the Morning Star, and helping to support their efforts with work of their own, often establishing a presence where actual churches did not exist. Cold and winter have always been a factor on the Maine coast, and in these years of limited medical knowledge, tuberculosis, flu, childhood diseases, these were big problems among island communities. As early as 1910, in response to this very real need for medical information and care, the mission began to consider how it could provide or facilitate medical care in the island and coastal communities. This, of course, was right in line with what Alexander MacDonald and the mission's board were discovering, that ministering meant taking care of more than just a person's spiritual needs. Health and general welfare were completely inseparable from spiritual welfare. Today's nurse aboard the Sunbeam 5, Sharon Daly, knows that this is one of the things that hasn't changed since the time medical care was first considered as a program for the mission.
You can't separate health into just physical matters. If somebody's has stress in their lives or spiritual problems, you can't just separate out one from the other because they're all interlinked.
What is true for Sharon today was true in the early 1900s too, and the mission saw the need for medical services and responded. A first experiment in 1910 brought Dr. C.C. Morrison to the islands by mission boat. There were also the first successful engagements of nurses aboard the boat and in the communities at this time, nurses who could assist doctors or take up medical matters in the absence. 1920 marked the first of a long-time cooperative effort between the American Red Cross and the mission, an arrangement that continued until the late 1940s. Over the years, dedicated nurses Rebecca M. Douglas, Marie A. Smith, Grace Wilbur, and many, many other dedicated people would serve the islands. Taking into consideration the realities of health care in those days, the rudimentary equipment, the limited medical knowledge, the lack of financial resources, what the mission and its staff were able to accomplish was nothing short of remarkable. Executive Director Gary DeLong remembers his own mother's part in one of the mission's medical efforts on Beals Island, down east, where he grew up.
When I was in high school, my mother was a pastor's wife. My father was a minister on the island for years and years, and She was a nurse, and there wasn't any doctor, or doctors would sort of come and go in that area. There was no hospital in Machias, just down the coast, as there is now. And she got concerned about the lack of prenatal care and how far women had to travel to deliver babies, and so she started a maternity home. And she did that in partnership with the Maine Seacoast Mission.
Of course, the mission's work extended into all areas of medical care, from babies to broken bones to preventive health care and home hygiene. Classes were given throughout the 20s, 30s, and 40s about everything from care of the sick, disease awareness, nutrition, and household sanitation. Much of the basic information we take for granted today, but which was all new then. As 1910 came to a close, the mission had begun what would become a 100-year tradition of responding with care and concern. The directors had learned that the permanent nature of their work appealed strongly to the coast people and noted that the movement of the boat and those aboard had become a fixture in island communities, and the mission's presence was growing. In 1911, a schoolhouse at Eagle Island was built under personal supervision of Alexander MacDonald, and the foundation was laid for a church at Head Harbor Island. Reverend Hannah J. Powell served at that Head Harbor Island church, as well as at Louds Island and Frenchboro, and among others, her involvement laid the groundwork for many women to come in mission service. In fact, many of the staff of the mission over all its years would be women. If anything, the early work of the mission was most naturally shouldered by women because, though it was a hard life, much of what was needed most by islanders centered on home and family. One of these remarkable young women was Edith Drury. Ted Hoskins, formerly the mission's boat minister and now minister to coastal communities and fisheries, remembers her.
I first came to Isle Ho some 60-some years ago, and it was very much a part of my life as I was growing up and has been ever since. Part of my memories of those early years is of a woman named Edith Drury.
By the time Edith joined the staff as a teacher in 1945, she already had a long history with ministry and with the mission through her father, Reverend Samuel S. Drury. The elder Drury had served on the mission board since 1930 and was head of the prestigious St. Paul's School for Boys in New Hampshire. Both Samuel Drury and his daughter were imposing figures, but it was Edith who left the indelible mark on mission history. Longtime mission board member Patricia Scull worked with and was great friends with Edith Drury and remembers her well.
We all were very fond of her, and she was a complete character. And she was charming and fun, and she really was wonderful. She was brilliant, I think, really. But she looked like her father. And you probably know that her father was no beauty. I mean, he had this great nose, and then he also had this kind of a bright or dark red skin. And so she stood out in any place she was because she was very unusual looking.
She was a person who made a difference, and no one who met her or interacted with her ever could forget her. Her coming to the island with the special things that she would bring with her, whether it was a packet of seeds or a Bible or whatever it was, made a difference.
The boat in these early years was still the Morning Star, and though she had served well, she simply wasn't fit for winter cruising. In 1911, Dr. A.F. Schaufler made an overture to the mission that the cost for a new boat would be taken care of by a person he referred to only as a friend. It later became known that this friend was Mrs. J.S. Kennedy, a woman who would be an avid and substantial supporter of the mission right up until her death in 1930. The story is told of how this first purpose-built mission boat got her name, that Mildred Robinson, a lighthouse keeper's daughter on Mistake Island, made a simple and enthusiastic suggestion that would become mission legacy.
The Morning Star needs more than paint, I'm afraid.
Well, the Morning Star's a beautiful boat, but she's not fit for winter work. She's a summer boat.
Reverend MacDonald, hello.
Greetings, Mildred.
Hello, Mr. Bowden.
Hi, Mildred.
What brings you out all this way, Mildred?
Just to see you, Reverend. The Morning Star. She's a lovely boat.
She is a lovely boat, Mildred, but she's tired. Boats can get tired too, just like people. So we are going to build a new boat. Oh, she'll be lovely too, but stronger, better suited to the mission's purpose.
It sounds wonderful. A new boat for the mission.
A new boat. And Mildred, we have to get together on a name for her.
Well, the Morning Star was a fine name for a boat. But you know how the morning star twinkles just before dawn? Sort of a way to say goodbye to the old day and hello to the new at the same time.
What a fine way to look at it.
And the sun follows the stars as day follows night, right? After the morning star, sure as anything, comes the sunrise. Brave little sunbeam, to follow the dark night and beautiful stars like that. Sunbeam, do you like that name?
That's her name, Mildred. Sunbeam.
The Sunbeam was completed, launched, and dedicated at Camden in 1912. She would be the first of 5 boats to bear the name. The Sunbeam was a fine, new wooden boat, 57 feet long with a 13-foot beam, framed of native oak, planked with yellow pine, powered by 2 gasoline engines, and the hull wrapped with a wide band of copper sheathing that ran above and below the waterline, a design feature added to assist in breaking through the inevitable ice of winter harbors. Still, this first Sunbeam was much less of a working boat than the mission required. But it's a testament to the abilities and determination of her crew and the mission that the first Sunbeam made it possible for the mission now to spend its first full year on the water in 1912, and she continued to serve for 14 years. These years also saw the arrival of something new at the mission, in this case a tradition that would last through the organization's first century and beyond, the Christmas program. In 1911, the Colby College chapter of Sigma Kappa sorority dressed and wrapped 8 dolls as Christmas gifts to be distributed by the mission. Unbeknownst to anyone at the time, these simple gifts were the seeds of a program that would grow to reach thousands of people, young and old. The Christmas program grew and adapted to changing times, always with each gift carefully selected for the recipient. Sometimes the gifts were more practical, and during periods of war or extreme economic strife, the Christmas program would focus more on giving shoes and clothing. But the joy of giving and the excitement about the gift were the same, as coastal resident and mission supporter Billy Thompson still remembers.
When we had the Christmas presents that they used to bring, and we looked forward to that, because that would be probably the best present that we would get. We'd get a candy bag, and we'd get a nice present. I remember one year I got a blue sweater, sleeveless sweater, and my mother couldn't get that off of me all summer.
So the familiar package's bright white wrapping tied up in red soon became a treasured part of the holidays for many along the coast. Every gift brand new, never a hand-me-down, and many especially handmade for the mission. Nathaniel Guptill is the son of one of the longest-serving mission superintendents, Orville J. Guptill. Nat was just a very young boy when his father was first with the mission in the 20s and 30s. And perhaps that is why the impact of the Christmas program has stuck with him.
There are hundreds of kids along the coast that wouldn't have a Christmas present if they weren't for the Maine Seacoast mission. But they're never forgotten, and they feel that somebody cares about them, and that somebody remembers them, and it makes them glad.
The mission's contemporary Christmas program serves not only island and coastal families, but also residents at youth centers, nearly 100 children in foster care, and of course many elderly coastal residents in nursing homes and care facilities. When World War I closed many overseas markets for shellfish, the European markets for clams virtually disappeared, and life for fishermen's families suffered. And in part because the steamers that would have normally run the coast were discontinued due to the war, the Sunbeam did a lot of ice breaking, a chore that would forever remain on the mission boat's list of things to do. By now, the mission carried the official endorsement of numerous other denominations, the state of Maine, various government officials, superintendents of schools, and physicians. But many challenges still lay ahead. Though the world was heading out of war, by 1918, life on the islands off the Maine coast was slow to recover. But mission staff were spread thin in the post-war years, with many workers serving primarily as teachers. And in 1918, Alice M. Peasley joined the mission staff, replacing assistant missionary Maud Douglas. She came to be known as Ma Peasley, and her name would soon become nearly synonymous with the mission itself. By all accounts, Alice Peasley was a formidable woman with seemingly endless amounts of energy and brimming with ideas. She settled with her family on Crowley's Island, but her work would reach throughout the entire range of the mission's service area, and she was eventually made the second full-time employee of the mission. In the mid-1920s, Peasley was instrumental in setting up summer youth programs, what they called vacation schools, in South Gouldsboro, McKinley, and Little Deer Isle. Foreshadowing the mission's contemporary work in Washington County, Mrs. Peasley's South Gouldsboro School was a weekday school of religious education organized as a part of the public school system. She was a tireless worker and one with an uncanny sense of the value of publicity and promotion. In a world where the concept of marketing hardly existed, Alice Peasley was an expert. An interview she gave for a Gulf Oil Company travelogue in 1946 hints at these abilities.
I am speaking to you from the cabin of one of the most remarkable boats that has ever sailed the high seas. And here to tell us about the work of the Sunbeam III is Mrs. Alice M. Peasley, one of the pioneer workers of the Maine Seacoast Missionary Society. Mrs. Peasley, tell us about some of the unusual features of this boat.
Well, Mr. Hurley, the island people call the Sunbeam III God's tugboat. For over 40 years, this boat and its predecessors have served people of all faiths in the villages and communities along the coast of Maine. And that's a right big parish when you consider that the Maine coastline is the longest in the United States.
Well, with all those parishioners, Mrs. Peasley, the Sunbeam must be called upon to perform some unusual task.
You bet it is. I guess no.
Certainly, Alice Peasley was one of the most remarkable people to serve the Maine Seacoast Mission in its first 100 years. In 1920, the mission was still in a phase of major growth, and this made it necessary to establish more permanent headquarters. With this in mind, the board decided that the mission should move out from under the roof of the Bar Harbor Congregational Church, where it had been operating since its start, and rent the house and grounds at 24 Ledgelawn Avenue in Bar Harbor. Ledgelawn Avenue became not only the home for the mission superintendent and his family, but also offices and a home base and lodging for mission staff. 24 Ledgelawn Avenue would be the home and public presence of the Maine Seacoast Mission for most of the next 50 years. As the roaring 20s roared by, Maine was still mostly concerned with the roar of progress and how the mission could help the island communities keep up. Then, as now, the mission knew that education offered the hope of keeping island life viable, even in the face of tremendous change. It was at this time that Sigma Kappa Sorority, the same group who gave the gifts that helped create the mission Christmas program, voted to adopt the mission as its national philanthropy and to pay the annual salary of a mission worker, a woman who would be a permanent teacher to the island communities. And in a further commitment to education, in 1921, the Sigma Kappa Sorority established an educational fund to provide scholarships, another seemingly simple gesture that would resonate well into the mission's second century. Though some of the details have changed, the mission's education fund and scholarships now have even greater impact. and perhaps no one knows this better than Mission Executive Director Gary DeLong, who was a recipient of mission scholarships while he was in college.
One role that I sometimes play is handing out scholarships at high school graduations, and I think that while it's a fairly straightforward program that lots of people hand out scholarships, there's still something about the mission's commitment to that. It means a lot, and sometimes I have trouble talking about it without getting a little emotional because I see those kids. They look like I looked when I was this young kid coming out of Beals High School.
By the turn of this century, the mission was awarding between 60 and 80 scholarships to area students for college and vocational training. But as the winter of 1922 was taking hold, an era of the Maine Seacoast Mission was about to come to an end. 1922 had been an extremely difficult year for the mission, with a December as cold and icy as any in recent memory. Despite his advancing years, he was 57, Alexander McDonald seemed to come through the year with characteristic good health and strong spirit. He headed for the Sunbeam on the morning of December 4th for one of his customary pre-Christmas visits to the islands.
Morning, George. Mr. Sawyer, give my best to young Charlie. On my way, Edwin. I'm all ready, Edwin.
And with those few words, Alexander McDonald died. Having suffered an apparent heart attack, he had slumped to the deck of his Sunbeam and was gone before any of the crew could reach him. The official cause of death listed as heart trouble, but it's hard not to believe that, like Captain Henry White before him, the difficult work of the mission had taken a toll on Alexander McDonald. This was now to be Angus McDonald's time. Alex's brother had served the mission in his own way for all these years, quietly, an intellectual force often behind the scenes. He was just 55 when the mission board placed him in the position of director in May 1923. Sadly, within months of his appointment, Angus became seriously ill, and though he would remain in the nominal service of the mission for 3 more years, his active service ended almost at the same time as did his brother's. And in April of 1926, Angus M. McDonald died in Bar Harbor, Maine, at age 59. The years immediately following the death of the McDonald brothers were difficult for the Maine Seacoast Mission, in part due to inevitable shifts in leadership. Reverend Charles W. Turner was appointed to succeed Alexander and Angus McDonald at the head of the mission, but his service would last only a few short years. By 1925, Turner, too, was forced to resign for health reasons. But there was a man waiting in the wings, and the board of the mission knew where to find him: Orville J. Guptill. In presenting him as their choice for the next superintendent, the board members offered the following explanation in the 1925 annual report.
Our minds turned at once towards a man who 2 years ago, after the death of A.P. McDonald, we had selected as his successor. But he was unavailable at the time, being engaged in home missionary work in the state of New Hampshire. He begins in early April after being released by the New Hampshire Home Missionary Society.
Orville J. Guptill was a man of many facets who had previously taken a run at the Senate and was an avowed socialist, and his was a more contemporary personality to head the mission.
My father was an exceptional person. He was very smart, he was very intuitive, he was very dedicated, and to everybody he related. He related to rich people and poor people and others as well.
One particular asset Orville brought when he came to the mission was his wife Annie, who quickly made herself an indispensable part of mission work.
She had been my father's assistant in all the parishes he'd served and in all the other jobs, and she just kind of fell into it. And she never asked for pay. She just regarded it as her duty to help him.
Guptill's tenure at the mission would be marked by his particular abilities at fundraising and what today we would call PR.
My dad was a 20th century Robin Hood. He took from the rich and gave to the poor. Of course, he wasn't as violent as the original Robin Hood was, and he made them feel good about giving. But even so, that's what he did.
Orville J. Guptill would head a mission with a slightly different focus, and both he and Annie would serve side by side until his death in 1938. But in 1924, Orville J. Guptill's tenure was just beginning, and much was happening. Almost immediately upon taking the position with the mission, knowing the condition of the Sunbeam, Guptill engaged the board to take steps to raise money for a new boat. And in 1924, Alice Peaslee received 2 blank burlaps from Mrs. Leonard Kellogg. These began the rug hooking industry that helped support struggling families and churches. Under Peaslee's management, these 2 burlaps were just the beginning. A tremendous amount of work went into the preparations for the rugs, tinting, pattern making, preparing the looping supplies, much of which Peaslee did herself. But the local women crafted the rugs themselves. Despite other connotations of the word, these women soon became known as the mission's hookers. Though rug sales would rise and fall in the coming years, the work eventually made a name for the mission and the hookers, with people returning each year for additional rugs or new designs. These industrious women continued to create these useful, valuable works of folk art until just before World War II. Orville J. Guptill was well aware that the work of the mission was expanding perhaps as never before. The mission had established such a fine record of achievement that the scope of the work was bound to expand, and Guptill was making plans for that new boat. The first Sunbeam had traveled well over 100,000 miles during her years of service. She was ready for retirement. And in August of 1926, the Sunbeam II was launched at Damariscotta, though the boat wasn't fully ready for service until November. The 80-foot-long boat was designed by Albert Condon and built at Morse Shipyard in Damariscotta. In many ways, this was the first truly purpose-built boat for the mission. She was diesel-powered, generally considered seaworthy and dependable, designed specifically for breaking ice and to stand the worst of winter storms. Unfortunately, the Sunbeam II had leakage problems from the beginning, but her few problems did not prevent the otherwise sturdy boat from serving the mission well for nearly as long as her predecessor. Though the stock market crash and a nationwide depression lay ahead for the country as a whole, on the coast of Maine, always a bit apart from the rest of the nation, things were a bit behind, as one local was reported to say,
"Now, we never had prosperity, so how can we have a depression?"
So the work of the Maine Seacoast Mission pressed on with the problems at hand. Like Alexander MacDonald before him, Orville J. Guptill realized that communication was a crucial element for the viable life of the islands. So under his leadership, the mission was instrumental in bringing telephone service to island communities, among them Matinicus and Cryhaven. By 1930, the endowment had grown, and the list of those who helped keep the mission in service reads like a who's who of American business and philanthropy: Kennedy, Ford, Carnegie, Rockefeller. But as the U.S. economy hit bottom in the Great Depression, calls for help to the mission for clothing, food, supplies had never been greater, and the human value of mission services far outweighed the operating expenses of the Sunbeam II. But by April of 1936, the hardships of service to the mission had begun to take their toll on Guptill, and he tendered his resignation to the board.
When Dad realized he had high blood pressure, and was going to have to retire early, he began looking for somebody who had missionary aspirations and ambitions. And he found a young man named Reverend Neil Bousfield, who was the son of missionaries in a foreign field.
And in Neil Bousfield, the mission was to find its longest-serving superintendent to date. Bousfield was the son of Baptist missionaries and was himself a Baptist minister in Lemoyne, Maine, a man who knew a lot about Maine and its people. He has been described as a complicated man, friendly and jolly, one who pushed the organization forward and carried on the mission work with enthusiasm.
Neil was more, in a sense, Neil was a mission to me. He just was.
If people's memories of Bousfield seem a bit divergent, it is perhaps because of his complex character. But his was a personality that would serve the Maine Seacoast Mission well for more than a quarter of a century. Soon after wrapping up his work with the mission in October of 1938, Orville J. Guptill died. He is quoted in that year's Christmas bulletin as saying, "I have fought the good fight, I have finished my course, I have kept the faith." But in spite of the sorrow at his loss, the mission kept on, and a special drive was already underway to raise the $30,000 necessary for a new boat. The Sunbeam II had done her share of the work, so in 1939 she was sold to Associated Bush Pilots of Pilottown, Louisiana, and she began commercial service on the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico. In December of that same year, a new boat, proudly christened Sunbeam III, was launched at Damariscotta, Maine. In 1941, the new Sunbeam boasted the mission's first sea-bound radio telephone equipment, and it's remarkable to think that the mission boats went without something so simple for so long. It wasn't until 1942 that the Sunbeam III got what would become the emblem of the Seacoast Mission, the cross on its hull and roof. Such identification was necessitated in part by the onset of World War II, but the image of the cross on the bow would quickly become an icon of the mission's many services. The Sunbeam III served the mission well for more than 23 years. Throughout the 1940s, the mission's services continued to expand under the able leadership of Neil Bousfield. In support of the war effort, the mission encouraged victory gardens at island and coastal homes. The mission's library flourished under the able management of the Reverend and Mrs. Anson Williams. Williams was fondly known simply as the pastor, and he and his wife arrived in Bar Harbor in 1941. Together, they helped provide a presence at Sargent House in Bar Harbor, which had recently been donated to the mission in memory of Mr. and Mrs. Winthrop Sargent. While Mrs. Williams managed Sargent House in its purpose as a home for girls from the islands who were boarding on the mainland while attending school, Pastor Williams covered broader geography, serving as the mission's pastoral presence in more than a dozen Down East communities. And he also took over as mission librarian, organizing the literally thousands of books into central libraries at Sargent House and in Jonesport. Over the years, Anson Williams traveled many miles, managing the distribution of literally tons of magazines and the circulation of 10,000 books, and touching many lives. And in the 1940s, the Sunbeam III was on duty, taking up when other boats were unable. She even assisted the armed forces in ice-breaking along the Damariscotta River during 1942. In 1945, as the war was ending, Captain William M. Berry joined the mission as captain of the Sunbeam III. Bill Berry came from a long line of Canadian sea captains on one side and ministers on the other. A strapping, handsome man, he was himself a naval veteran of World War II. Before the war, he had been a missionary, serving all over New England. Berry's skills were many, but it was perhaps his temperament that was his greatest asset.
When I first came here, I had the privilege of spending some time with Bill Berry, Captain Berry, who had been the skipper of the boat for many, many years. And he was just a class act. I mean, he was a guy who, of deep but very quiet faith, but also highly competent boatman. And as I talked to him literally on his deathbed, he was still very lucid and spoke with such quiet conviction about what the mission meant to people and what it had meant to him and how important, how much he enjoyed the job.
Bill Barry stated his personal mission simply soon after coming aboard as captain in that same 1946 Gulf Oil Company travelogue. When Mrs. Peaslee was asked about all the various tasks the Sunbeam was called upon to do, she replied,
I guess no one knows that better than our skipper, Captain William Barry here.
About all I can say, Mr. Hurley, is that we're ready any time, day or night, to pull up anchor and set our course to wherever people need help.
Captain William Barry did prove his mettle, ready any time, wherever people needed help. But he had quite an introduction to this broad definition of mission service. Barry had barely started with the mission when the staff and the town faced an emergency that brought everything in Bar Harbor and on Mount Desert Island to a halt. The Great Fire of 1947. The fire struck on October 21st and burned for days, destroying a number of the elegant seaside homes, damaging much of the town. Memories of that time tell of the tremendous cooperation witnessed between the professional fire squads and ordinary townspeople, everyone pitching in however they could. And the Sunbeam did her part, ferrying people away from the worst areas of the fire over the course of the blaze and serving as a floating billet for firefighters who needed a rest or a meal. The 1950s were the start of a new way of life for many in America. The country was bracing for the start of the police action, the Korean War. A new thing called television was becoming popular. And in 1963, as the world came to terms with yet another war, this one in a faraway place called Vietnam, the mission acquired the chapel and parsonage at Cherryfield, Maine, that would come to be known as the Weald Bethel. Weald Bethel, the words mean a place in the woods where God dwells. The mission had long had a presence in Washington County, Alice Peasley's work there, as well as other ministerial and educational efforts. But the acquisition of this 60-acre tract of land meant that the Maine Seacoast Mission would now have a stable, permanent presence and a future in Washington County. Ground was broken for the new chapel there in 1964. And by 1970, Weald Bethel would be the home of a community nursery school established under the auspices of the mission. In the early 1980s, programs there reached out to the other end of the age spectrum as Weald Bethel became part of the Senior Companion Program in Washington County. Reverend Martha Shaw, recently retired pastor and program director at Weald Bethel, started with the mission there in 1988. Marty made many contributions to programs at Weald Bethel and oversaw the upgrade and expansion of the campus there. With Marty in the lead, the mission was able to develop a wide network of services supporting people from all walks of life, most notably victims of domestic violence. And by 2002, the programs at Weald Bethel had expanded to include a thrift shop, food pantry, house repairs, emergency financial assistance, and the mission's innovative rural after-school program, The Edge. The staff there are now a resource for education for all ages, victims of domestic violence, and an array of family service. The 1960s meant changes at the mission as a whole, one of which was the replacement of the Sunbeam 3. The planking and hulls of the Sunbeam 3 were worn from years of ice breaking and wear and repairs. Well, knowing that ice and ledges were inevitable in the Maine waters, the mission made plans for a new boat, leaving behind wooden construction in favor of a steel hull. On March 2nd, 1964, the Sunbeam 4 was launched, christened with waters collected from island communities served by the mission, and water from the Jordan River in Israel. When she left the dock that day, captained by William Barry, she was expected to last the mission for at least 40 years, and she almost made it. Later in the decade, A young man by the name of John Drake, Jack, joined the mission as minister of music. He was to leave his mark on the mission's work for the next 30 years. Jack Drake's path to mission service was an unusual one. He remembers that he had come to Bar Harbor Hospital for medical treatment and had come away with a job.
I came to Bar Harbor to have some surgery. And before I went in for surgery, a man I'd never met came to the hospital room and said, "I'm Neil Bousfield from the Seacoast Mission. I understand you're a musician. We need a musician at the Seacoast Mission. Would you like to come and help us?" And I said, no, thank you, that's fine.
But as it turned out, Jack spent more time at the hospital than was originally planned. Neil Bousfield, though, was a persistent man. Bousfield visited with Jack again after his surgery, asking once more if Jack would be interested in joining the mission.
And I still said, no, I think I'll just go along with my life, thank you, and that'll be all right. In days afterwards, I began to think maybe there was some reason why I was supposed to be visited by this man. And so I sold my business and I sold my home in Connecticut and I moved to Bar Harbor, Maine to come to work for the Seacoast Mission.
Jack began music programs at many mission churches. He organized inter-school music events, but these were only part of his duties. Jack Drake served the mission in a multitude of capacities from 1967 until 1999, having assumed the position of superintendent in 1984. So his was one of the longest and strongest associations in the mission's 100-year history. In 1971, one of the most familiar presences the mission has ever known first came aboard. In October of that year, David T. Allen joined the staff as engineer aboard the Sunbeam 4. David Allen had been working in and around saltwater for many years before coming to the mission, spending some time as a commercial fisherman. According to many, Dave's appointment to replace the beloved but soon-to-retire Bill Berry was one of the best things ever to happen in the history of the Maine Seacoast Mission.
Bill came to the office to see Neil Bousfield to tell the boss that he was going to retire. He had already decided whom he wanted to follow him, and he told Neil all about David Allen. And so David came on the boat as an assistant for a while and settled into the job. And the boat, the ministry of the boat, just blossomed with he and Betty.
Perhaps it's true that the best judge of a waterman is another waterman, because it turned out Bill Berry was right.
The fishermen love to go up and talk with Dave in the wheelhouse because they want to talk fishing. And Dave can do that because he's been fishing. He's done all the different types of fishing over the years, so there's nothing that he misses or isn't able to share in.
Wasn't long after Dave came aboard the Sunbeam that he became acquainted with the woman who would become his wife. Her full name is Elizabeth. She's known to all as Betty, and she is as much a part of life on the boat as is David. And while Dave is not technically Betty's boss, now they work better as a team.
So they asked if I wanted the job, and I said yes. I would try it to see if I worked out, and they were happy with me, and I was happy with them. And they said one stipulation. David could not be my boss. So.
I've never been the boss.
You think you are.
Betty, whose cooking is renowned on every island and every village the mission serves, sees the boat more than just as work, but as their life.
Oh, I don't think it's really a job, it's a pleasure. It's like going to every island's a hometown. I enjoy that.
Perhaps it's the kids who will remember David Allen the most because they think he has a secret.
Well, Dave's Santa Claus. I mean, every kid who comes on the boat thinks it is Santa Claus who has a day job, and he's warm, he's kind and generous. He's quiet and confident, and if he says it's too rough for the boat to go, then it's too rough for the boat to go. It's unusual that it's too rough for the boat to go, but when he makes that call, we know he's right.
Their skill, competence, and caring spirits would make Dave and Betty Allen almost indistinguishable from the spirit of the Sunbeam herself for more than 30 years. 1972 was a landmark year for the mission in other ways. This was the year that the mission would begin its move to a new address leaving its longtime home at 24 Ledgelawn Avenue behind. In an act of remarkable generosity, Ruth and Tris Colquitt donated the buildings and grounds at 127 West Street to the mission for use as a headquarters. The home, originally known as La Rochelle or Little Rock, has been the base of the mission business and many of its programs since. While the imposing structure may seem to some at odds with the mission's humble beginnings, the building serves the mission's contemporary tasks well. It provides space for administrative staff and guests, and the volunteer elves of the tremendously expanded Christmas program, and youth programs, and the mission's public functions, and for community-wide celebrations of life such as weddings. As the mission made the move into its new headquarters, another soon-to-be familiar face was joining the staff, as in 1972 the Reverend Stanley B. Haskell began duties as boat minister. Haskell quickly developed strong relationships with the island communities and developed a reputation for being a person of tremendous generosity.
Stan was the most giving person you'd ever run across. He drove us crazy at the mission house because we would, it's the wintertime here in Maine, and we'd usually bring in cans of soup and stuff to put in the closet in case we couldn't go out for lunch. And we'd go in the closet to get our lunch, and it'd be gone. And we'd say, Stan, do you know anything about the can of soup that was, yeah, well, I gave it away. But the clincher was one day when we went and we found the can of soup, but we couldn't find the can opener. And we asked him, he said, yes, there was a fella came in and needed a can opener, and I gave it to him. And that was the kind of guy that Stan Haskell was. Give everything.
His ability to connect people to the mission and to each other would be the hallmark of his time in mission service until his retirement in 1985. It was also 1972 when Raymond D. Hahn assumed the position of mission superintendent. He would serve the mission for more than 11 years before leaving in 1983 to assume a pastorate of 2 churches in Connecticut. By 1980, the mission included a full-time staff of 15, and in 1985, Tony Burkhart began service as boat minister. Now, Tony Burkhart was no stranger to the mission. He had spent the preceding years in service in Washington County as pastor at the Asheville Community Church. Tony was also the one usually behind the wheel of the mission's Recycle-Mobile, the traveling arm of Wheeled Bethel's successful thrift shop. As a trained counselor, Tony brought those special gifts to his service aboard the Sunbeam, and though he would be with the mission for relatively few years, his work on the islands would not soon be forgotten. In the early 1990s, the Maine Seacoast Mission remained on firm footing, thanks to a history of strong fiscal management and vision. Like his predecessors, Jack Drake had kept the mission moving forward. Also, like his predecessors, Jack was about to preside over the introduction of a new Sunbeam, when in 1993, Theodore G. Hoskins joined the staff as missionary pastor aboard the Sunbeam 4. Ted had actually been a part of the mission since the 1960s, serving for years as summer pastor on Isle Ho, but this was the next step. It would be far different from a full-time pastorate he had held for many years in an affluent Connecticut community, but this ability to be welcome in many different worlds is seen by many as one of Ted's greatest assets.
The unique thing about Ted Hoskins is that he's equally at home with the natives on the island or the summer folk. He comes from a background of both. He's lived on the islands long enough to know how island people feel. He shares their feelings, and yet when it comes to talking to summer people and knowing how they feel, he can do that too, and that was the unique gift that he brought.
Ted's remarkable voice, sincere and direct way of speaking, and commanding presence were a good fit to the work.
Ted is sort of, in some ways he's right out of central casting. I mean, he's got the beard, he's got the voice, he's got the, you know, and yet in no way is he trying to play a part or a role. He's just the real deal.
By 2002, Ted was on the move again. As part of the mission's energetic strategic planning processes, Ted moved from his duties as boat minister into the newly created position of Minister to Coastal Communities and Fisheries. This new job reflected the mission's renewed efforts to help fishermen and coastal communities better communicate with environmentalists and governmental agencies.
My mission is to attempt to carry through what I learned as boat minister for a number of years and see if there is not a way to enable these local communities to participate more effectively in the decisions that are going to make all the difference in the world about their futures. A number of people would like to call me a lobbyist. I assure them that I am not, that my real role is to encourage fishermen to be their own lobbyists, to become articulate advocates for the things that concern them and for the future that they hope to find.
Ted's new role is continuing in the fine tradition begun so many years ago when the mission first realized that its work would take a broader form, helping coastal communities build better lives for themselves, even in the face of a rapidly changing world. In one way, the year 1995 brings the mission into its present incarnation. This was the year of the launching of Sunbeam 5, the boat that serves the mission into the start of its second century. The Sunbeam 4 had been in service for nearly 30 years and had served well, but even such a fine boat could not keep up with the rapidly expanding needs of the mission. They simply had outgrown the current boat, and more space and utility were needed. And on January 3, 1995, the Sunbeam 5 was launched at East Booth Bay. Now, some 10 years later, the Sunbeam 5 remains as fine a craft as she was when she was launched, but she bears the happy wear and tear of a community space well used and well cared for. The paint stains on the tables in the salon are testament to years of happy art students that Betty Allen has shepherded through painting and craft classes. The impressions on the cushions around the salon speak of many worship services, many celebrations, many meals, many friends.
Heedless of the wind and weather, la 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 la.
Nearing the end of the mission's first century, in 1999, the board appointed a new man to lead the mission and its programs. In certain ways, Reverend Gary DeLong represents both the exciting future and the illustrious past of the Seacoast mission. When Gary DeLong's commitment to outreach and community caught the eye of the board of directors in their search for new leadership, he was essentially new to the mission, or so everyone thought at first. It was his remarkable record of service that drew their attention, but in a turn of fate or felicity, and without realizing it at the time, the board had in fact found a man whose main roots are deep. Gary, himself a minister's son, grew up on Beals Island and went to high school there, graduating in a class of 8. His mother, Blanche DeLong, was a nurse and one of the many women who filled in the gaps left in coastal communities by the lack of local doctors. She was particularly concerned about the lack of proper prenatal care, and she became a force behind a maternity home that was begun in partnership with the mission. These memories would stay with Gary, his father preaching, his mother being called upon for medical help or to lend a hand to a needy neighbor, through his own pastoral education. In a striking coincidence, Gary completed that education at the very same school that once graduated mission founders Alexander and Angus MacDonald, Andover Newton Theological School.
There is certainly a connection between the MacDonalds of 100 years ago and the Gary DeLongs of today, in that they had a theological background. But interestingly, I don't think that that's been the primary thrust of the mission. We're not out to proselytize a particular religion, but it puts us in a position where we can deal with the emotional needs of a family, we can deal with the spiritual needs of the family, we can deal with the physical needs of the family, and sometimes the medical needs of the family. So it's a continuation of the concept that the MacDonald brothers started with.
Considered by many to be a man of great intellect and even greater understanding, Gary DeLong is the embodiment of a connection between the old Maine Seacoast Mission and the new. The mission's board of directors at the time Gary was brought on board was under the leadership of a man of great vision, Edward Greaves. Ed is a man of remarkable enthusiasm and dedication to the mission, and his passion ignited a new spirit of relevance and engagement among the board and staff. He was chair of the search committee that brought DeLong to the mission, and Greaves immediately recognized the great gifts and sense of symmetry that Gary DeLong would bring to the mission, thoughts he often shared with Gary.
Gary, you were raised among fishermen. You have worked among the affluent and the most fortunate. You have been sent to us to bring both of those worlds together, to do the work God has for you to do here.
The two men worked closely together and with the board and staff, initiating the mission's first comprehensive 5-year strategic plan. The vision of that plan is to deliver critical services to those most in need while striving to redress the root causes of those needs. To meet these ends, the mission commits itself to being a source of hope, strength, and encouragement to those on the coast. The mission now faces new challenges, entirely different from those envisioned by its founders so many years ago. But perhaps one circumstance continues to be the greatest concern to the mission and the people it serves: the continued sustainability of life in these small island and coastal communities. Matinicus resident Eva Murray first came to the island as a teacher in 1987, and she stayed, eventually marrying Paul Murray, who had been connected with the island since the 1970s. Both of the Murrays can speak with authority about what makes island life possible.
I think what actually makes the difference is the post office, the power company, the air service, and the oil boat. Then you've got the next level, the sort of fine points, the things that make living here more comfortable. And that would be things like when the Sunbeam is in the harbor.
To me, the things that are important in living on an island, in a small community off the coast, you do definitely need the infrastructure, the things like heat and the electricity, but you also need community. You need a sense that you're not here all alone. And the mission in the person of the Sunbeam and their crew, they come and they show us that we're not alone.
David Lunt, whose family has been on the island of Frenchboro since before the mission came to be, knows that some of what was true when he was a boy remains true today.
Well, there's three things that will sustain island life. In school, if you don't have a school, then you are going to get no younger population. You'll only have the older population, and of course you can't sustain a community with an aging population, so you have to get younger ones. The church seems to be a gathering point that will keep things together and keep the community united. So if you do away with a school, you do away with a church, and you do away with the post office, then your island is gone.
One factor of coastal life that has not changed much since the mission first started: island life can be very isolated, and you don't have to be on an island to feel this isolation. The very same phenomenon can and does occur in coastal communities down east. People who make their lives along the coast today are much like those who lived in the villages and on the islands when the mission first began, and it has made these people a breed apart. Current Maine Seacoast Mission Board President Fred Hutchinson knows this sturdy character well. He's had a lifelong connection to this state himself, has served for many years as president of the University of Maine.
I think for many of them, they're very rugged individuals. They work for themselves. They don't work for anybody else. And they're willing to face the hardships of doing that. And I think that brings out a real individualism.
Their livelihood means that these people must be in these sometimes impractical or inhospitable places. But for a community to survive and to thrive, certain realities must be addressed, particularly for the year-round residents.
As pastor of the Outer Islands and the Sunbeam, we have a particular concern for the folks who live year-round on the islands. We know that that's a different sort of circumstance than people who live seasonally. And we have a commitment and an interest in nurturing their lives and being helpful in any way that we can, make it a little bit easier to stay on that island all year long.
This is also one of the reasons Ted Hoskins' new role as Minister to Coastal Communities and Fisheries is so important.
We have an extraordinarily wonderful way of life here in Maine that is available to us and yet is slipping away more quickly than we would like to admit to. And we have an opportunity in this short span of time to make a difference in what happens in the future. And if we can get local communities in all their breadth, not just the fishermen, but the total communities, to begin to understand the issues that lie before them and to study the things that are involved and the possible implications of things that come before them, and then choose to participate at whatever levels are appropriate, whether it's just a local meeting or whether it's in a regional area or at the state legislature or even at the regional fishery management councils or even in the federal halls of Congress. That is what my job is, to help them get to that place.
One of the ways that the mission has positioned itself to support these communities into the new century is by taking advantage of advances in medicine and technology, taking health care to the islands in ways never before possible. Introduced in 2001 and renamed in 2003, the Island Health Services program of the Maine Seacoast Mission represents the return of regular health care services to the island after an absence of some 30 years. Using high-speed telephone lines and cutting-edge medical technology, the telemedicine program connects patients on the islands to their doctors on the mainland.
I think telemedicine is always hard to explain until you see it. They usually know the provider on the other end of the telemedicine unit. The Sunbeam's a very comfortable spot for them, so they come on, they have a cup of coffee, they visit, and they come into the exam room and they see a provider that they know.
It sounds like a simple thing, but when you consider that for many island residents, a trip to a healthcare provider can mean an all-day trip to the mainland at substantial transportation cost, this simple connection becomes incredibly valuable. As with so many things at the Maine Seacoast Mission, the spirit of the program can be found in the people who provide the services. In this case, Nurse Sharon Daly.
I think I try to be a real resource for people for whatever it is that they might need in navigating the medical system, which is a very confusing at best.
It has been welcomed. It has been more successful than I thought it would be, in all honesty. I think that the most important factor of the telemedicine project is the nurse. It is Sharon. Having the video hookup to an MD is useful and valuable, but I think that is secondary to the presence of the nurse.
As with all the staff of the mission, and in keeping with the philosophy that has sustained the organization for 100 years, it's Sharon's job to identify a need and find the ways best to respond.
She is incredibly competent. She knows what people are looking for. She'll put together programs if with an inkling of interest. She'll do a talk on Lyme disease or cancer, or anything that people might have an interest in. And people know and trust that.
Part of that responsibility and part of the telemedicine program is reaching out.
Sharon is a good person because she will go and visit, and she can pick up things from just visiting that can lead her into looking at other things. She does that with all kinds of different people here. Some people that go to see her on the boat, but sometimes it's people that don't even get to the boat. She goes to them.
Reaching out with compassion and caring, information and leadership, restoring faith, all of these are part of the work of the Maine Seacoast Mission. Nowhere is this more evident than with the crew of the Sunbeam.
99% of the Seacoast Mission is the Sunbeam on Matinicus. And what is so valuable about the Sunbeam is the people aboard the Sunbeam.
In terms of raw numbers, the Sunbeam touches relatively few lives, but that is just one context of the mission's work, and everything needs to be taken in context.
Well, you had a man say that the numbers don't add up because we don't have the big numbers on the boat. But if you're in New York City and 10 people show up at a meeting, that's bad numbers. But if you're on Isle Ho and there's 25 people on the island and 10 show up, that's good numbers.
Rounding out the crew of the Sunbeam is Rob Benson, who was appointed as pastor to the Outer Islands in 2002. Like others before him, Rob came to the mission in a sort of roundabout way. He and his wife had spent their honeymoon on Isle Ho, where they met Ted Hoskins and became acquainted with the mission's work. When word came of Ted's moving on, Rob mulled the opportunity for a while, but knew it was something he should pursue. An open, thoughtful, and accessible person, Rob's temperament and skills were a fine fit. Eva Murray was on the committee assembled to select the new minister.
We're not looking for somebody who's able to come out here and solve all our problems. We're looking for somebody who's willing to just show up. And a lot of the job is just showing up.
And Rob does show up without fail.
I'd say that the non-traditional or the less traditional parts of my job are simply going out and meeting people, trying to have a rhythm and a consistent rhythm of reaching out to people, stopping by and having a cup of coffee or some tea and just finding out about what their lives are. And I think that's true for a minister anywhere in the country, in any context, rural, suburban, or even urban.
Our current boat minister is a very gifted young man. He uses the boat often to get where he is, but sometimes if the telemedicine schedule has the boat somewhat more restricted in terms of where it has to be and when, and if his schedule needs to be somewhere else, he is very resourceful about using mailboats, fishermen, planes. He'll fly out of Owl's Head to get out to Matinicus.
Tapping every resource to help as many people as possible. That's what Rob does. That's what the Sunbeam does. That's what the mission does. And it's what it has done without fail for 100 years. One new resource being developed by the mission is the EDGE program. Launched in 2002, based at Wheeled Bethel, the EDGE is the mission's cutting-edge response to contemporary challenges in rural education. This innovative program follows directly and gracefully along the paths forged so many years ago by mission pioneers Alice Peasley and Edith Drury. The EDGE program takes its name from former Mission Board President Ed Greaves. Even up until his untimely death in 2002, his dedication to improving the lives of young people never wavered, and he made a lasting impression on everyone at the mission. He cared deeply about the people of Washington County. He never lost sight of the really big picture. He knew that even small works, individual programs, a single person helped through a crisis, one hand held in friendship, it all adds up.
We are called to place some big bets. Let us never forget that this is God's work that we are doing here.
The heart and soul of the EDGE program are Charlie and Wendy Harrington, who work together as project director and adult and community education coordinator.
The thing that they bring to this organization is understanding of how young people think and what their aspirations are and what their problems are.
They originally had a notion that they might do an alternative school, but superintendents really were adamant about needing something after school. So they decided, after doing a number of interviews with parents and educators, that after school would be the focus.
What I do is look at how we bring adults and other community members, which might be organizations, into the EDGE program, and looking at how they can bring something that we need within that program. For example, we have a connection with 4-H, so we have that whole national organization helping us with what we do with our curriculum. And we're looking at doing programs that include families, because families need to be part of any program that we do.
Families and children looking for ways to build a better life, greater opportunity. These are the very same ideals that first brought the mission into being. And with the EDGE program, the mission will be reaching again into the next century.
After-school programs, and the EDGE in particular, help build skills for the 21st century, what employers are looking for, such as communication skills, problem-solving skills, ability to work within a group. And After-School and EDGE helps to create and develop those skills among the students.
That's at least some of the story of the Maine Seacoast Mission's first 100 years. You may have thought it was all of the story, since the program has lasted only slightly less time than that 100 years. These have been years of economic ups and downs, political upheaval, fantastic changes in commerce and technology, joy and sadness. These have been years of change. The Maine Seacoast Mission has changed with the times and been graced by the involvement of literally thousands of dedicated staff, board members, financial supporters, volunteers, people who have brought light in the darkness of winter, medical care to the sick, a helping hand when that was needed, people who have brought hope.
If the McDonald brothers were to come back and look over our shoulders today and see what we're doing, I think they'd be pleased with what we've done, but I think they would be surprised to find many of the same needs that were here on the islands when they were here. We haven't really eradicated the things that they found. What we've done is to lift people up one person at a time and change their lives.
I believe the Seacoast Mission is going to be here for a long time, the way it looks to me, and as long as they keep this house and the boat and do things the way it's going now, it's going to be here for quite a while.
I really would like to see it continue and maybe broaden the scope of what it's going to do, and more than the ministry, it's going to be one of the things that's going to save the Way Island way of life.
I think that there will always be needs. People will have needs, always. And we, I hope, will continue to be an organization that responds to those needs to the degree we are capable, and to within the focus of the programs that we deliver. I think even though we will change, and we already are changing, have been changing, the concept, and I would use that word concept, of the mission has been, I believe, consistent from the beginning.
The Seacoast Mission has had a legacy of actually delivering on some of the promises that we've made. We show up in the middle of winter, we show up when someone's died and they need transportation to a memorial service, or they need us to help bring a casket out to the islands. We're the ones who keep showing up, and I think it's almost a 100-year legacy of that kind of reliability.
I would urge whoever hears this in the future to not look at the activity of the Sunbeam as something anachronistic or of the past, or no longer necessary or no longer appreciated. It's hard to express your appreciation for something so sort of intangible as people who are trustworthy and friendly and reliable, just showing up and being part of your life.
I am very optimistic. I would say that the next century of the mission is going to be just as exciting as the past. It may not be quite as melodramatic of reaching an island in a storm, but we can continue to make significant impact upon the community of the state of Maine.
The mission of this organization is to be a source of strength and encouragement and compassion, reaching out to the individuals, the families, the communities in our service area, from mid-coast Maine to the Canadian border, and to do it in an inclusive way.
I think that we have ourselves set on a track of service that is significant in its effect upon the coast of Maine. And I think if we keep listening and responding and giving, we'll find more than enough for us to do, at least for another 100 years.
Now it's time for the Maine Seacoast Mission to focus on the new century with new programs and new thinking, with renewed energy and services that respond to the changing needs of island and coastal people. The Maine Seacoast Mission, after 100 years, still true to its purpose. Always inclusive, responding in crisis, supporting a better life. The Maine Seacoast Mission, a century of hope on a sea of change.